These two pieces of artillery on movable foundations is the start of Woolwich, which was an Anglo-Saxon word meaning trading place for wool. And it was a really small Kentish fishing village which Henry VIII decided to build a Royal Naval dockyard here. And it was opened until 1869, by which time the ships were too large to make it this far down the Thames. And the Woolwich dockyard was responsible for HMS Beagle, which carried Charles Darwin on his great voyage of discovery. Part of the old Woolwich dockyard. And just a bit further along here are the remnants of the dry docks from the dockyard. If you'd stood here in the late 18th century, you'd have seen the great prison ships moored here out on the Thames. So many convicts would have been transported here, and they'd have stayed in the hulks of the old warships at night and then forced to work on the Woolwich docks during the day. A ferry has been operated here since the 14th century. That free ferry opened in 1889 and then supplemented by a foot tunnel. Maximum speed 10. I better slow down then, I'm a speedy walker. So whilst I'm waiting for the ferry, let me tell you about the Princess Alice. And that was on the 3rd of September 1878, and it was returning to London Bridge after taking day trippers out to Gravesend, and it sank right there about 7:30 p.m. and about 600 people drowned, most of them overcome by the toxic outflow from the sewage works and various chemical factories all along the river's edge. About 500 bodies were recovered from the Thames in the week following the disaster, and loads more found by the exit door of the ship when it was eventually pulled from the riverbed weeks later. And it was one of the worst maritime disasters, and happened right here. Isn't this so cool that it's completely free?
The crew will instruct you in the use of equipment and assist you
So I'm walking in to the Royal Victoria Gardens, and they were opened in 1890 on land acquired by funds raised through public subscription and a donation of £50 by Queen Victoria. And until the 19th century, this part of North Woolwich was just all malaria marshlands, and it formed part of the ancient manor of Ham Marsh. So this is quite a cute story. In 1850, a man named William Holland, who used to own the Pavilion Hotel in North Woolwich, laid out a pleasure garden here. It's one of the most popular entertainment areas in London, and he'd have trapeze artists and fireworks and monster baby shows, but he was a bit of a character and he escaped his creditors by leaving the park in a hot air balloon. And then unfortunately it fell out of favour and the gardens closed in the 1880s, and the land was then converted to the park that we now see now. It is very cold and vaguely unpleasant. So this is the Tate and Lyle factory in Silvertown, and Henry Tate, whose art collection is in Tate Britain and Tate Modern, first set up the manufacturing site here in 1878 and produced the very famous white sugar cube. And then his rival, Abraham Lyle, the original Lyle factory, home of golden syrup, was just further along near Plaistow. And then they merged in 1921 to be Tate and Lyle. A lot of the girls and women that came here from the sugar mile were aged about 14, and they used to socialise with each other here, and they would call themselves as either Tates or Lyles depending on which site they'd worked on. It's the Tate Institute, and it was financed by Henry Tate in 1887, right opposite the Tate and Lyle, as a community centre for all of his workers. And it has been a library, and it's also been an air raid shelter in the wars, and sadly now completely derelict. So this church, which is a bit obscured unfortunately, was the home of the Bricklay Music Hall, and it was the only music hall still operating regularly in London. And it was built as in the Gothic style, and then in the 1980s was nearly destroyed in a fire because of pigeon droppings accumulated in the chimney. But the roof fell down and extinguished the flames, and funnily enough there's a fire engine, so that's perfect timing. So I'm now in the Thames Barrier Park. And that was the first riverside park to be opened in London in 50 years. And French landscape architect Alain Provost carved it out of a 22-acre decontaminated brownfield site. And the most photographed feature is the Green Dock, and that's a 16-foot deep sunken garden that runs diagonally across. And this is where I'm going now. And it's supposed to reference the industrial maritime past, so its green dock ripples with undulating topiary. This is so cool. Now is a good time as ever to tell you about Silvertown. So Silvertown was named after a rubber factory that was opened in 1852. Samuel Winkworth Silver opened it, and they started making waterproof fabric. And then they later developed and diversified into rubber cable covering, and then they started to produce and lay telegraphic cable under the oceans. And then this area of Silvertown, the rubber factory disappeared, but Silvertown then became famous again in 1917 with the Silvertown explosion, and it's the greatest explosion in London's history when 50 tons of TNT caught fire in a munitions factory. 70,000 buildings were damaged, 73 people were killed and 400 were injured, and here is the memorial to those 73 people who were killed. That pub across the water is called the Anchor and Hope, and it was called that because it had good views over the river, and the sailors would sit here drinking a pint and hoping that the wind would pick up so that they could set sail. This is Mill Road, which leads to the Millennium Mills, which we're going to now, a former flour mill built in the early 1930s on the site of a former mill. So here is a 19th century chimney stack that's been left in the middle of a roundabout, and just behind it is the Millennium Mills flour mill, and this is quite a distinctive landmark, and it's been used as a backdrop for quite a number of films, Ashes to Ashes, and in videos for bands like the Smiths, Coldplay and the Arctic Monkeys. So in the earlier 20th century, the flour millers, W. Vernon and Sons, became very famous for their Millennium flour, and they later joined forces with Spillers, and this is when they built this vast complex of reinforced concrete granaries. And its location was perfect because all the grain ships would arrive at the Thames and berth at the Royal Docks. The wheat would then be removed from the ship by suction, but when the Royal Docks closed in the 1980s, the mill closed as well.